Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening on J. Slay, Made in the USA, where we explore truth, expose deception, and inspire courage. Guys, this is the second episode in my Heroes series where I highlight people and personalities and productive activities where they are going against maybe the mainstream narrative, and they're doing it in a bold and original way. And my guest today, Chad Jackson, definitely fits the bill for that. Also with the Hero series is somebody that's making a difference in the lives of people, whether that be personally to me or also on a larger scale. And Chad Jackson was a former guest on this show. It was actually 3.5 years ago, and it was right in the middle of the Uncle Tom series coming out. So I'm going to give a quick bio for him, and then we're going to bring him on. Chad O. Jackson is a Dallas-based entrepreneur and researcher who starred in the hit 2020 film Uncle Tom and the subsequent 2022 film Uncle Tom 2. He's a frequent contributor to podcasts, radio shows, news programs, and the Uncle Tom YouTube channel, making the case for individual responsibility for your success and your feelings over dependence on government. And that includes the right wing as well. So I know people, a lot of times think of that as a left wing thing, government dependence, but he makes a great case showing both sides of that issue being a problem. Now, Chad's work, as I said before, it's meant a lot to me personally because his films helped me navigate a very confusing and high-tension time in our country regarding racial issues only a couple of years ago. His commitment to truth shines through his work, and he has the ability to disrupt or even upset both sides of the political aisle, which I've come to find after doing this for 3 years now, that is usually a clue to someone who's being really honest in both their research and the way that they're putting out what they have to say in their messaging. With the upcoming release of the Martin Luther King assassination files, the somewhat recent revelations about MLK's personal life and beliefs that are becoming better known every day, and then Chad's new film, Martin Luther King, American Hero or Marxist Thug, which is going to be released, I believe, in April. This is probably the perfect time to have Chad Jackson back on the show. Chad, thanks for coming on, brother. So glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive right in, man. So, right now you are working on a film, and I'd like to get your kind of lay of the land on where things are at for you. Cause I know 3 years ago when you were on the show, you were right in the middle of, I think you were in the middle of filming the Uncle Tom 2, but a lot has happened since then. So what's going on now? And tell us a little bit about this upcoming release.
Yeah, so I live a pretty simple life, believe it or not. I own a plumbing company here in Dallas, and since the release of the film, I've been focusing more on that company. God has blessed us with the ability to basically grow and to we do new construction and service, so to do a lot of new construction projects across the state of Texas. But this calling to be able to use what talents I have in filmmaking to go after the truth and to basically correct the historical record on a number of different things has led me to make the decision to go full time into filmmaking. So I'll likely be closing my plumbing company by 2027, just kind of slowly transitioning out. And again, it's been a blessing with my plumbing company. We haven't had to do any advertising. All of our work has been by word of mouth. So that's something that is kind of difficult to give up because, to give up formally, just because it's like, I genuinely believe that as a man, who God has equipped with a mind that's capable of creativity, and hands that is capable of craftsmanship, we as men must be ever utilizing the utilities that God has given us. And so, but at the same time, I am only one man with 4 kids and and a wife, so I can only choose one thing as a profession if I'm going to be able to give the work that I do its due, right, and the time and the care that it needs. And as such, because I think that we are at a crucial time in Western civilization, these stories do need to be told. This historical record needs to be corrected, not only when it comes to the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, but on a whole slew of other things as well, including the true story of Darwinian evolution and how that propaganda came into being, including the story of, again, a whole number of things that don't just pertain to race. And so I resolved to start a company called Historia Revelata, which is Latin for history revealed. And the whole premise of this company would be to produce short form and long form documentaries, as well as literature for youngsters and adults who are interested in learning true history. And the point of this is not necessarily to equip people with an arsenal of weaponry to engage in party warfare, but rather to understand that there is a game that's being played. Political parties and politicians, activists wish to use you as political fodder to achieve some Tower of Babel-esque goal. And the question that you must ask as a Christian is, will I participate inadvertently or overtly in the laying of the bricks of this Tower of Babel, or will I set myself apart as unto the Lord? And so again, it's not to give people information and knowledge that they can just go and engage in the political warfare, but rather that they might be equipped to withstand attempts to draw you into this kind of demagoguery, to invite you in to participate in the building of the Tower of Babel. So it's more or less in keeping with the Bible when it says, don't be taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies. And there's many hollow and deceptive philosophies that are out there. And because when it comes to ideologies like communism, Marxism, which has taken on in the past century or so, this kind of Christian sounding language, many within the church are falling for this rhetoric and this ideology. And so it's important, in my opinion, to produce literature and films that educate people on just what that looks like.
Yeah. One of the surprising things, and that we will talk about later in the interview, I don't want to tackle it quite yet, but it's people have known within the church that Marxism is a problem, and some of the language being hidden, where the Marxist infiltrators are trying to get into the church and have been for 100 years. But it's where and who that's actually come from that I think is going to shock a lot of people. But before we get onto that, another kind of general overview here. 3 years ago, you were in the middle of the Uncle Tom movies, and they had a big impact on me because I think a lot of people like me were soft on history. Like I generally knew what had happened in history, and you were coming out with your films or the Uncle Tom films. Dinesh D'Souza did something on the history of the Democrat Party, things like that, and it was much needed for the time. But in a conversation we had on the phone just the other day, you said, Jeremy, there's a lot more to the story than that. It's really, you even said Uncle Tom 1 didn't have it right nearly as much as Uncle Tom 2, because Uncle Tom 1 was more of like Republicanism 101. So explain the evolution from Uncle Tom 1 to 2 to maybe where you're at now. And it might be a personal evolution as well.
That's a great question. I actually haven't been asked that question before. So when it came to Uncle Tom Part 1, which was then called Uncle Tom because no one knew that there would be a part 2.
Right. Yeah.
I was just minding my own business, running my company here in Dallas. And out of nowhere, I get a phone call from a filmmaker named Justin Malone, who is also Dallas based, who told me, hey, we're making a film about Black conservatives. And I heard that you are a Black conservative and wanted to know if you would be interested in my film. The reason why my name came up was because a long time ago, when I first got interested in politics, when I was in my early 20s, I would show up to meetings at the Dallas County Republican party meetings, the monthly meetings that they had. And I was pretty active in terms of showing up to the meetings. And when I started my business, of course, that took me away from having the leisure time to show up to these meetings. So I stopped going to them, but somehow or another, my name was still in the party records or what have you. So whenever Justin set out to make this film, he started with the local Republican Party naturally, and he asked the chairman, "Hey, who are the black conservatives who are part of this party, the local party?" And my name came up somehow. So he called me and said, "Hey, would you mind sitting down for an interview?" And I agreed to sit down with this for this interview. And the conversation just flowed naturally. He was asking a lot of really good questions. And what I was drawing from and answering those questions was my base knowledge from the public schooling that I got, as it pertains to, the Democrats, they're the real racists. They started the KKK. They're the Republicans are the ones that freed the slaves. Just this kind of surface level, cursory knowledge of history. And anyway, so Justin took that interview, flew to California, and was able to get a meeting with Larry Elder. Larry Elder watched that interview and said, "Sign me up." So he became the executive producer for Uncle Tom, and Larry was able to get Justin in contact with such people as Brandon Tatum and Candace Owens and Herman Cain, the late Herman Cain, Alan West, and others, and that's how you get Uncle Tom.
Yep.
So for me, I was already aware of cultural Marxism and ideological subversion and all those things back in 2018. I just didn't connect the dots in terms of looking at Martin Luther King as also part of that same clandestine, covert psyop. I didn't put Martin Luther King into that camp until later. In fact, it would have been a year later whenever I discovered that.
Can I pause and ask you a quick question about that?
Yeah.
Just very quickly. So you mentioned a lot of names there, Larry Elder and Candace Owens and Officer Tatum and Carol Swain. And are there any of them, though, that would have put Martin Luther King at that time, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, in that camp of maybe a Marxist subverter? Would any of them have gone there at that time in their own personal understanding?
Well, based upon the interviews and podcasts that they were in circa 2018, the answer is no.
Yeah.
The answer is no. I know with Carol Swain, she knew of attempts to attach the communist label to Martin Luther King back in the 60s and 70s. But I don't know to what extent she believed those claims. I know that she's come around to being more vocal about it. But back in 2018, I think it's safe to say that she believed that the civil rights movement was a high point for America, and that Martin Luther King was a genuine pastor who was just trying to get people to get along. Which, I think that more people are seeing now that that's nonsense. And I think some of it has to do with Uncle Tom Part 2. Okay. But I think it also has to do with some of the work that other folks are doing as well, in their own lane, such as, Vince Everett Ellison and others. But so Uncle Tom Part 1 was a kind of like kiddie pool, surface level Republicanism 101. And after the success of that film, there were a lot of people asking for a sequel. And I was approached once again and said, "Hey, how do you feel about coming along and being a part of Part 2? Not just as an interviewee, but as someone working behind the scenes." And I said, "Well, yeah." And at this point, I had already discovered a lot more than what I knew in Part 1. And I said, "Well, I'd be willing to do that under the conditions that I get to really tell a deeper and bigger story, more than just, Democrat bad, Republican good. I want to take the audience deeper. If you can grant me that, then I will downgrade my plumbing company and come work as a producer for Part 2. And they allowed it. And so I came on board and instantly began just unloading all of this research, all of this information. And that's how you get Part 2. And so they feel like two different films. In fact, I think it was a mistake to call it Uncle Tom Part 2. I think we should have called it something else. What that something else is, I don't know. But I think that we kind of did ourselves a disservice by calling it Uncle Tom Part 2 because, there's a whole audience out there, an untapped audience who didn't even see Part 1. And so by calling it Part 2, you're kind of you're already turning off people who were like, well, why would I watch a sequel to a film I haven't even watched?
Yeah.
Whereas if you called it its own independent thing, then perhaps we would have gotten a bigger audience. But that's neither here nor there. For me, I think Part 2 is the one. It is the one that people should see. It is the one that I recommend people see. But to the point that you made earlier, I guess it was good for its time, especially in 2020 being the year of the lockdowns and of George Floyd and the riots that were going on during the summer. And so for this film to be released amid all of that, showcasing, here are some blacks who don't adhere to this narrative that's being pushed by these this woke mob. I think it was good for its time, and perhaps it was providential because people they need their hand held on their way to the truth in order, whenever you just kind of rip open the curtains and you do this kind of information overload thing, you can really turn people off or possibly even blackpill them. And it's not my intention to blackpill anyone. I would rather white pill people as opposed to blackpilling them. You have to be responsible with the truth. You can't be reckless with it.
Absolutely. Why dig into the history at this level? And here's why I'm asking. So if the narrative that's being told, I was just in the Target bookstore and it's Black History Month. So you've got all these books about civil rights leaders, and Martin Luther King is first and foremost in those. And if the narrative being told is actually promoting good ideas or a good moral direction in the books per se, then how does the truth that may be not so pretty, what does that matter? So, explain that piece of it. I know you get asked that question a lot of why go after them if the overall net positive of their narrative seems to be good for people.
That's a very loaded question. But before I answer it or attempt to answer it, I guess my question for you in turn would be, what would you say was a good thing that came out of the civil rights movement? Like, what is this good thing that you're referring to?
I think the main thing that people say is that, it ended segregation and it gave equality on many levels. Now, the way that's played out over the decades, I don't think it's worked out how anybody wanted it to, except for those who wanted it to work out this way, which would have been the Marxists. So, you're asking me a very good question, but I think I'm asking you the question that most people would say. It's a very simple one, is everybody agrees that, not everybody, but most agree that the civil rights movement was supposedly good, and that the narrative around Martin Luther, I remember, Chad, going to my elementary school, and on Black History Month, it's I Have a Dream, and we're wearing the t-shirts for a full week, and we're being told that it's all about the content of character rather than the color of skin. I think in general, that's a good message. So to all of a sudden find out all these kind of horrific things about who Martin Luther King was, or that it was a subversive thing, it's very difficult to swallow.
Yeah. So thank you for answering that question. So let me just say that, first of all, this notion that Martin Luther King ended segregation, or that he is responsible for the racists coming along, getting along, is just inaccurate. Basically, what we're doing is we're falsely crediting Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. And in so doing, we're building up on that. And as such, we are perpetually destroying our country. We're perpetually destroying the fabric of our country. There's a lot of people who believe that Martin Luther King is the founding father of modern America, that he ushered in America 2.0.
Yep.
Even, Steven Crowder. I found a podcast where he was basically singing the praises of Martin Luther King. I think this was back in 2018 or 19 or one of those, but he's saying, he's praising Martin Luther King and saying Martin Luther King believed truly in the Constitution. That's not true. It's not accurate at all. Sure, you can look at the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, where he's invoking the language of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but understand that what he's doing in that speech isn't giving a nod to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He's co-opting it. That's what he's doing. See, Martin Luther King believed religiously in the tenets of Marxism. He was a Marxist. That's the ideology that he subscribed to from a very early age until the day that he died. And so what he believed is in the same vein as a Leon Trotsky, in the same vein as many Marxists who came before him, is that the Constitution and the language therein can be co-opted to push America into a different direction. The thing about Marxists is they chameleonize themselves with the country, with the culture, with the society that they wish to exploit, that they wish to subvert, in order that they might then implode it from the inside and make way for a Marxist revolution. That's exactly what Martin Luther King was doing. When we look at DEI, critical race theory, affirmative action, the LGBT movement, all of these things stand on the shoulders of the foundation that is the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They will tell you themselves that they draw their inspiration and their blueprint from the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was never a genuinely church thing. To the extent that Martin Luther King was a pastor, and you know this as well as I do, he was a fake apostate pastor. He went to Crozer Theological Seminary, which was made up of communist plants, because this is what the communists did as early as the turn of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. They infiltrated the Protestant church and the Catholic church. Bella Dodd, who was a communist who defected, basically admitted that she herself planted 1,100 communists into the Catholic Church who were able to make their way all the way up to the Vatican. And then too, with the Protestant Church, they infiltrated and infested the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, the Southern Baptist Convention. This is what they did. Martin Luther King did not believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. He did not believe that Jesus rose from the dead. He did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and he did not believe that Jesus was going to come again. He did not believe in the literal existence of heaven and hell. And so this is a man.
Is it from his own diaries that you're getting that? Or
yeah, it's from his own.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's 7 volumes of Martin Luther King's books, his writings, his papers, where you can find all this stuff. So I don't know if you can see all of these. Like, I got all the volumes of Martin Luther King's writings, and he's writing all these things. And the fact is, like, even to the extent that he gave all these speeches were written by Stanley Levison, Bayard Rustin, Clarence Jones, all of whom are communists. He believed whenever he went to Ghana back in 1957, I believe it was, to he went along with his wife and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. To a ceremony to watch Kwame Nkrumah, I think is his name. I forget what his last name. Become the leader of Ghana, which won its independence. Right? Really, it didn't win any independence. It was basically communist imperialism. But right after he left Ghana, he went to the UK and met with CLR James, who was a known communist here in the United States, who got kicked out of the country for his agitative and subversive work. So he went and met with CLR James, who was a communist strategist. And then he came back to the United States. he was always meeting with these known communists to kind of figure out what the next kind of plan was, what the next step in the revolution was. The idea behind Martin Luther King, or posturing him as this so-called moral leader of the 20th century, was to subvert the American people into going along with an agenda that they didn't know what that they were buying into. And so this is my long scenic way of getting back to your question. It's important to really expose the truth of who he was and what he was doing, because Martin Luther King is the limitless credit card that our government constantly cashes in on when it comes time to push some new legislation that will only serve to expand its own role at the expense of genuine liberty for the American people. And we fall for it because we are emotionally invested in this image, in this notion of who Martin Luther King is. It's difficult to really put into words, but I guess the best way that I could possibly explain it is because we do live in a constitutional republic where the notion is that we as individuals have a say in the trajectory of our country. The powers that be have to placate us. It's not a monarchy insofar that a king and his nobles can do whatever the heck he wants on a whim, irrespective of what the people have to say and what the opinion of the masses are, right? The nobles can push or do anything they want in a monarchy. In a constitutional republic, it's very different. However, in a constitutional republic, those nobles don't go away. They don't suddenly stop scheming and plotting. They have to change course. They have to change their tactics. Mm-hmm. And so where it used to be in the monarchy that they could do whatever they want, in a constitutional republic or in a democracy, you have to convince the people that the direction the nobles wish to take us is the best for us. And so you do so by planting these social justice movements and by planting these activists who are pushing us to relinquish our liberty, to relinquish our freedom into the hands of the government in the name of social justice, in the name of freedom, in the name of women's rights, in the name of gay rights. Every legislation that passes off the back of these social justice movements only serves to expand the role of the federal government on our quest toward globalism. That's what the purpose of it is. And so when we as conservatives say, okay, well, I like this about Martin Luther King, but I don't like that, we are being fools. We're being fools when we do that, because to do so would be to look at the Trojan horse and say, I understand that that's a Trojan horse, but oh, how pretty the colors are. Just look how pretty those colors are. I'm going to admire the Trojan horse. I'm going to get a replica of the Trojan horse made into a little statue. I'm going to put it on my mantle because I just love how pretty that thing is. And we should all glean from the beautiful colors of that horse. Well, it's a Trojan horse, which is symbolic of infiltration, subversion, rotting from the inside. That's what the image is all about. And so it's foolish to try to take and take the meat without the bones, because there is no meat as far as it's concerned. It's just all bones. It's all dry, dead bones. That's really what it boils down to.
How much of this in Martin Luther King, he's just one man and he's part of a bigger plot, and you said he's meeting with known communists. Was he more given his role and may have not have been completely conscious of the role he was playing to let's pull in the evangelicals and let's fake everybody out that this isn't really communism that we're pushing? And I maybe he didn't know that he was the brand guy, or maybe he did. But I guess the overall question is, was he conscious of this plan completely?
Yeah, he was very conscious of his plan. I mean, Martin Luther King went to a communist training school in Tennessee, Montegal, Tennessee, called the Highlander Folk School, which was known for training and giving tactic and strategy to the communist movement. It was started by Don West, who was a Methodist Catholic or a Methodist communist, and another guy by the name of let's see, there was Don West and there was Miles. What was his last name? I guess it doesn't matter. But yeah, I mean, your audience could look up the Highlander Folk School. Martin Luther King went there. As I said earlier, he went to Crozer Theological Seminary where he studied Marx and Engels. When you look at a letter that he wrote to Coretta Scott before they got married, when he was courting her, he said, the social gospel is the gospel that I would preach. He was well aware that the social gospel was a Marxist ideology. Not only that, when you look at communist agitation dating as far back as the 1920s, you had the Second Congress of the Communist International. Excuse me one second. My chair decided to drop down on me.
That's all right.
So you had the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1921, I believe it was, where John Reed, who was an American journalist, went before this committee, or this convention rather, there in Moscow. And he was a white journalist, by the way. And he said, well, the problem with expanding the communist movement in America is that the Negro is not politically conscious. We have to try to find a way to make the Negro in America politically conscious. And as a result of this speech, Vladimir Lenin, he greenlit American communists to use whatever means, whatever tactics necessary to awaken the Negro, to then use the Negro as political fodder, cannon fodder, in America. And like clockwork, you saw over the course of the 20th century, a lot of race riots that were springing seemingly out of nowhere. Whether what people call as what people know today as the Tulsa Race Massacre, the circumstances behind that has communist hands written all over it. Whether it's the massacre in Rosewood, whether it is the sharecropper riot there in Elaine, Arkansas, all of these things happening over the course of the 20th century, or over the 1920s, happened immediately after this directive came down from Lenin.
Wow.
Communists were bombing their own houses, bombing their own churches, and trying to, and then writing in the newspapers that this is a result of white supremacy, because they wanted to create friction between white and black. And not only that, and this goes back to your question, they were willing to use their own people as martyrs. You didn't have to necessarily die a physical death to be a martyr. Being a martyr means basically sticking your neck out and undergoing some kind of suffering or punishment, so you can then say, look, I'm doing this for the cause. And so being a martyr can look like going to jail and having your mugshot printed in the newspaper. That's an act of martyrdom. Being a martyr can be a nonviolent movement where you purposefully don't pull a permit and undergo the proper procedures and protocols to demonstrate in the streets. You just show up after church one Sunday and go demonstrate in the streets, knowing full well that the police are going to remove you for unlawfully gathering. This is what the kind of things that were going on in the 1930s, well before Martin Luther King. You had predominantly white labor unions who were that were communist front groups for all intents and purposes, who were being dispersed by way of hoses and dogs in the 1930s and 40s. And so this kind of making yourself into a martyr was part of the Marxist tactic, part of the Marxist agenda, dating as far back as the 1920s. They were doing it in the 1930s in California, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama. So this is the kind of milieu that Martin Luther King was born into. His father was a proponent of the social gospel, and he was also a part of several of these communist front groups as well. Whether he was himself a card-carrying communist, I don't know the answer to that question. I do know he was pink, though. He may not have been red, but he was certainly pink. And so when it comes to Martin Luther King, he understood. I mean, he was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. There's a lot of communist activity going on in Atlanta, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. And so he knew what this thing was. He knew what this movement was, and he was all too willing to play the part. And so he wasn't this naive Negro minister from the South who just wanted to preach the gospel, and he was just swept into the movement because of all the injustice he was saying. No, this was a very well thought out, well funded movement that he was all too willing to play a part in. His problem was that he believed his own press. They lauded MLK as a moral leader of the 20th century, and he believed his own press, and he began to get reckless with the drug use, with the fornication and the orgies, sleeping with prostitutes. He was warned on numerous occasions that, hey, you have to settle down. Your room is being tapped because, you had people like J. Edgar Hoover, who was an American patriot, as far as I'm concerned. If not for J. Edgar Hoover, America would have died a long time ago. America owes a lot to J. Edgar Hoover. And so the fact that he is treated the way he is today in terms of like our textbooks and all that, I think is a huge disservice. And it's interesting that anytime someone notable goes after the communists and is making headway, it's interesting how over time history doesn't treat them so kindly. Mm-hmm. And on the contrary, the ones who are communists, those become the heroes. That's a very interesting phenomenon. And it only makes me wonder, it's a matter of time before something similar happens to my legacy, which I don't really care about my legacy. I just want to do the will of God. But I think the truth is important. And so, anyway, they were telling Martin Luther King, they were telling Martin Luther King, you need to settle down with all of the fornication and everything that's going on, because if word gets out, all this is going to be ruined. But King knew that he was protected. He knew that he was protected by the White House. He knew that he had friends in high places. And so he believed his own press. He believed that he was the moral leader of the country. And eventually he got the best of him. Which that's a whole different story for a different day. But the lady who they called his second wife, he got into an altercation where he physically beat her up the night before he died. She stormed off and he didn't see her again. And the next day he got a bullet. So anyway, there's a whole lot there.
I want to go back to that in a minute. I want to say this first. I want to kind of ask your opinion on it. The magic of MLK, or the difference in him, is whether you're talking about any of the ones that came after him, and I guess the most recent, it's a horrible example, but George Floyd or any of those, the left wing was all about, they bought it hook, line, and sinker. They wanted it. The media, the left wing media, they loved it. They ate it up, right? The right wing, there were some people that fell for it and wanted to kind of, venerate George Floyd because they were caught up in a social justice church that maybe they didn't know it was a social justice kind of a church. But Martin Luther King, I mean, yes, the left likes him and maybe loves him, but the right wing and the right evangelicals, we have venerated him. I mean, if you ask, Franklin Graham about his father, Billy Graham, and, one of the first things they'll say is Billy Graham marched with Martin Luther King. And so for the evangelical Protestant, right wing, he's held in such high regard. I mean, me as a show host, Alveda King's much more likely to come on my show than she is go on some left-wing program. So what's up with it? How did that work so well for the legacy of King, where he got both sides?
I'm trying to find this book. So I'm just going to wing it. Yeah. So are you familiar with, and I think I probably mentioned this, the last time I went on your show. So pardon me if I'm being redundant here.
Have
you heard of Walter Lippmann?
I don't remember.
Have you heard of? Okay, so Walter Lippmann was he was a political expert who was part of the Greenwich Village dinner party scene at the turn of the 20th century.
Okay.
He was also an advisor to a number of presidents and politicians in the early part of the 20th century. So he wrote a book called Public Opinion because he was very interested in shaping public opinion. To give you a brief understanding of Walter Lippmann's philosophy, he didn't believe in a constitutional republic where ordinary people had a say in the trajectory of their community, of their state, and of their country. He believed that all that should be left up to the expert class. He believed in empowering an administrative state, the expert class, to shape society for the people, for the common good. That's the basis of what his philosophy was. And he believed that when it came to the public, that their opinion should be shaped by the press to go along with the dictates and the edicts of the administrative state, of the expert class. So in his book, it was either The Phantom Public or Public Opinion. I want to say Public Opinion, which was published in 1922. I think that's the one, actually. In fact, I have it right here.
Wow.
But so in the book, he says that if a campaign, a policy that the administrative state wishes to push forth is out of vogue with the masses, the objective is to put it into vogue with the masses, to basically get the masses to go along with it. And the way to do it is to put forth a speaker, an activist, who will use rhetoric and use language that the masses can resonate with. And Walter Lippmann says that you pinch a grievance, you use symbolism of patriotism, you use religious rhetoric to try to get the masses to gravitate to the speaker. And once that speaker gets into the good graces of the public will then be all the willing and all the ready to go along with whatever political policy, whatever policy of campaign that speaker put forth. Never mind, and this is a key part, never mind the fact that the policy of campaign is hypocritical or contradictory to the rhetoric that they used in the first place. Mm-hmm. I'm enamored of you now. So I'm not thinking of philosophy or principle or coherence or anything like that. Whatever you're saying must be true because I like you. You're someone I find familiar because I see you on my television screen. I see you in the newspaper, so on and so forth.
Oh, hey, Chad, just a quick example. I mean, even with Trump, I mean, you got almost 90% of the Republicans that voted for Trump. If Joe Biden would have floated the idea of a North American, greater America union kind of thing with Canada and Mexico, and we're going to own it all, or Greenland, they would have gone nuts about the New World Order, globalism. This is
right.
it. This is it. We got to fight this, the last stand. But Trump does it, and everybody from, Benny Johnson to Ben Shapiro are like on board. Like they love it.
There you go. And this goes back to the fact that man is unprincipled. And this is why Jesus said you must be born again. And this is why Jesus said, again, he said you must be born again. You must put off the old man and you must become a new creation that only God can do, that can only be done through sanctification. And again, I alluded to this verse earlier about not being taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies. That word captive is very interesting to me because when you're taken captive by something, imagine somebody who's in captivity. They don't have freedom. You can only do what your captor tells you to do or influences you to do. So you're taken captive. You're under the the hierarchy of some other thing, some other entity. People who are in prison don't have freedom, right? They can only go outside for so many, hours a day, so on and so forth. So you get the imagery. But where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And so when you look at these hollow and deceptive philosophies that are around, the kinds of hollow and deceptive philosophies that Martin Luther King himself was pushing and advocating for in an underhanded way, to the extent that we buy into it, we are taken captive. And in that state of captivity, I kind of liken it to intoxication. In that inebriated state, you're not looking for patterns. You're not looking for, oh, well, that contradicts this, and so this is why it's important to be principled. Yeah, you just want the next thing that feels good. And so for me, like, we know that God is not a God of confusion. We know that, even when you read about the church and how the church is supposed to be established and set up, and the order of worship, its structure, its stability, we know too. Paul talked a lot about beware of false prophets. He said, anybody who preaches a gospel that's different than the one we preached, let them be accursed. And so Martin Luther King was literally preaching a false gospel. He was an apostate. And it wasn't just him. There was a lot of individuals who was doing something similar, not just pertaining to race, but pertaining to the women's liberation movement, to the gay liberation movement, to things that were going on once again in the Catholic Church as well as the Protestant Church. So there were always these kind of wolves in sheep's clothing who were following the line of what Walter Lippmann was talking about in terms of getting into the good graces of the people that you might then mislead them. And so, again, this is my long, whimsical way of getting back to your question and saying that, to the extent that you have conservatives who fall for the trickery in the theater, my question is, to what extent are they actually principled? To what extent do you actually believe in conservatism or in Christianity? We know from the scriptures that even the elect will be misled in the last days. So I try not to be too harsh with people. But my thing is, what is your objective exactly? Those who are all too willing to go along with, to the point that you made, a new world order, a new world agenda, just because it's coming out of the mouth of a so-called Republican or conservative, but you're not willing to do as much when it comes out of the mouth of a liberal or Democrat. This goes to show that you're not actually that principled. You are more interested in winning an election than you are in the truth abounding. And that's not me. I'm always willing or more interested in the truth being disseminated than winning the next election, because elections are temporary. There's term limits, especially when it comes to who the president is. Yeah. But to the extent that you're building your castle on lies, that castle is going to come crumbling down sooner or later. Only the truth can solidify a strong foundation.
That's right. A little off topic here, but I want to get your take on this thing with Trump. I've felt this way, and I want to hear if you agree, disagree, that some of the low-hanging fruit stuff, some of the stuff that's like just so obviously wrong and against common sense, transgender men in women's bathrooms or whatever, or the border just being wide open, so we're going to shore that up, or let's do some common sense things to improve the economy. Trump's giving his base what they want in some of those areas, and that's good. I welcome those things. However, I feel that it's being used a bit as a smokescreen to go ahead and do the artificial intelligence vaccine programs. Go ahead and meet with Bill Gates to talk about the future of vaccines. Go ahead and give Benjamin Netanyahu whatever he wants in the Middle East. Like stuff that the conservatives may have issue with, maybe, but they're so enamored by this really easy stuff that anybody should do, but he's doing it. It's almost like we got so far out of whack that you just got to make these very simple, easy changes and everybody's happy. But some of the really big stuff, I mean, I just don't hear that many conservative commentators upset about the fact that Bill Gates is not trying to expose the fact that, that Donald Trump is not trying to expose more about Bill Gates and what he did, but yet he's meeting with him and talking about the future of vaccines. So again, it's that principled thing. But my question to you is, do you see that as well, where there might be a smokescreen on some of the social issues and the economic issues so that some of the geopolitical stuff he can get away with?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
And this is why I commend you for the work that you're doing, and very few others like you. I think social media it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's done a disservice, but also it creates a really good opportunity. It creates a really good opportunity insofar that you're doing what you're doing, but it also is a disservice insofar that you are always going to have the so-called conservatives who are going to cheerlead every time Trump opens up his mouth. Doesn't matter what comes out of it.
Yeah.
They're just going to be online with their pom-poms cheerleading. And to the extent that you have influencers cheerleading, it creates the illusion of a thing being popular. It creates the illusion of a thing being a movement that gives you chills and something that you can get behind. It's that low-hanging fruit. Can you believe that Trump is going to, take, men out of women's sports? Isn't that great? Okay. I mean, yeah, that's fine, but there's bigger fish to fry. I mean, I'm not a fan of Vivek Ramaswamy, but he actually made a really good point in that X post that he posted a few months ago. Or was that last month? I get my time mixed up. But when he said Americans are so enamored of who the prom queen is, whether Jimmy can run a football down the field, and sports, sports are good insofar that there is a character building component in sports. I'm a former high school athlete, and a lot of I gleaned a lot from playing football, especially with the coach that we had. So I'm not knocking sports, but the our priorities are misaligned. I guess let me just put it that way. Mm-hmm. And what Vivek was doing in that X post was saying that, unfortunately, Americans do have their priorities misaligned, and it's for that reason that you do see a kind of falling behind in terms of tech and other industries. Whereas, we all know a lot of the Asian cultures, because they prioritize education, because they prioritize things like STEM, they're more advanced in those departments than Americans are. And again, that's to even say something like that is it's triggering for a lot of people. And I understand that, but at the same time, there's some truth in there, and the truth hurts sometimes. And so for me, it's like, when it comes to this idea of men shouldn't be in women's sports, yeah, but there's more important things than what's going on with sports. That's not to say focus on this thing over here and don't focus on this thing over there. But at the same time, understand to what extent you're being played. Understand to what extent these psyops are going on around you. These distractions are going on around you. But yeah, I guess I share your feelings and your sentiments when it comes to that.
Yeah,
and I think once again, there's a lot of Republican and conservative influencers who are monetarily incentivized for cheerleading.
Yeah.
And even if they're not monetarily incentivized, they understand that they get clicks and they get plays, and they get followers from just jumping onto the bandwagon and constantly reacting to the latest thing, the latest lower hanging fruit. And so it's unfortunate, because not too many people are willing to do deep dives or not too willing to look at the thing behind the thing.
Yep.
It's just too easy to jump at the first thing because that's an instant gratification kind of thing. So it's part of our human nature to do that. And so again, I can't knock those people too much, but again, it's just a disservice because it's like, I believe that our politicians, they take advantage of that. I mean, these people didn't study years upon years of the cognitive sciences and the soft sciences just for the hell of it. No, they want to understand human behavior. They want to understand the way that people move, especially the way people move collectively and as groups, so that they might then exploit that and use it to their advantage as they grab all the more power. So I think the only way to really fix it would be to do some self-reflection. And once again, look at how susceptible am I to being played? And how do I not continue to be played?
Yeah. I mean, is one good indicator of that to ask yourself, how driven or directed am I by my emotions? Do I make decisions based on how I feel or based on what I see as the facts after doing some research? Do you think that's a good way to look at it sometimes?
100%.
Okay.
100%. Yeah.
You know, I, to add a little bit to what you're saying about on the conservative side, because that's where most of my relationships are. You know, I know several influencers with Turning Point USA and with PragerU and others that they see me as a friend, but they see me as dangerous or risky. And I've done interviews with them, and they'll call me afterward. Hey, before you air this, please pull this part, because my publicist said, if you air this, I'll never get invited back to this or that Turning Point event, or, you know, I may lose my paycheck from this group. You know, I'm not want to call anybody out, but it's a fact. It's real. You know, they will lose their paycheck or their invitation to the club if they talk about certain issues, even if they feel them. So it's a real thing on both sides. And we know a lot of people think of that as a left only issue, but it's not. It's a right issue as well.
No. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, for me, I've long left the whole kind of like partisan identity. I left that a long time ago. And I think that there's a liberating component to that, because you're not so, well, when you're not a part of any kind of partisan cult, you're able to see on both sides the way that everybody's just falling for the banana in the tailpipe.
Yeah.
And once you get to that place, I think it's important to not how do I want to frame this? It's important to not grow this kind of ego where you move through the world with this kind of esoteric disposition of, I know things people, you know, that the Republicans don't know or that conservatives don't know. Look, what Jesus, again, I'm going to always take it back to Jesus. Whenever he looked, I forget where this is in the Bible, he said he looked at the crowd and he had pity for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Yeah. He had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so for me, it's like, there's so much noise, there's so much fuzz going on, and we're so easily distracted, like sheep. I mean, we are like sheep.
Yeah.
And we're constantly looking for a shepherd. We're constantly looking for the next thing.
Yeah.
And there's so many things that pacify us, right? Yeah. The Super Bowl, there's just so many things that pacify us. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't enjoy your life, but at the same time, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where, you know, because we do have this illusion of we have a say in the matter, there's all this propaganda that's going on to try to condition us to feeling a certain way as we move along this quest toward globalism. So many of us are either passively along for the ride toward globalism or actively along for the ride toward globalism, whether we are waving a Republican banner or a Democrat banner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt about it. Well, let's speak to those who would be emotional for a minute about the issue of Martin Luther King. And, you know, and I understand it because I used to be one of them. I mean, I really, really venerated that guy personally a lot. But then, you know, this is one of those documents right here that's kind of floating around the internet. Can you see this?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, you may be able to answer like where this came from, what it is. I've not personally done a lot of research on it, but when you read it, Just indulge me for a minute. I'm gonna read some of this. So it says, King's personal conduct with the funds he had received from the Ford Foundation. King held the first of 2 workshops in Miami, Florida in February of 1968 to train Negro ministers in urban leadership. One Negro minister in attendance later expressed his disgust with the behind-the-scene drinking, fornication, and homosexuality that went on at the conference. Several Negro and white prostitutes were brought in from the Miami area. An all-night sex orgy was held with these prostitutes and some of the delegates in attendance. A variety of sex acts deviating from normal were observed. I'm kind of going to skip down a little bit. Many of those present engaged in sexual acts, natural as well as unnatural, for the entertainment of onlookers, so public. When one of the females shied away from engaging in the unnatural act, King and other of the males present discussed how she was to be taught and initiated in this respect. So I'll stop right there and just say this. So people could read that. If it didn't say thing about King being involved, they could think, well, that was maybe happening in back rooms, or he was at some convention center and it was done, somewhere else after the fact. Where is this document from? And is this true?
So this document is from the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. And that was initiated by Bobby Kennedy at the request of J. Edgar Hoover, where they were trying to figure out to what extent were the communists involved with the civil rights movement. And so with their counterintelligence program, they were able to plant recording devices as well as undercover agents into Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they were able to find a lot of this kind of stuff that Martin Luther King himself was involved in. Of course, there are actually recordings of MLK involved in
audio.
Audio recordings of MLK, who was also involved in these orgies and things of this nature. So
where can you find those? Where can you get the audio?
Oh, those won't be released until 2027, apparently, according to a court order that was that came down in 1977. They gave it 50 years, and so it's unclear whether it's unclear whether the recordings will be included in the batch of declassified files that will be released either as a result of the Trump executive order that he just signed, or the materials are supposed to be released in 2027. When Trump signed that executive order, all it did was gave the government 45 days to come up with a plan to release the files. So I don't even know what that means, to be honest with you. Well, does that mean that immediately after that 45-day period, all of it will be released? Or does it mean that exactly what the executive order says it means, which is a plan will be agreed upon as to how to go about releasing these files? So it's really unclear.
And I find it weird that they put Anna Paulina Luna in charge of the JFK files, the Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, the RFK, the 9/11. Like, I mean, she's a freshman or sophomore member of Congress or whatever. Like, it's hard for me to take it very seriously.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, I'm keeping my ear to the ground and looking forward to the files coming out. But again, I don't know when it will be or how it will be rolled out. But I think there's going to be some important information in there. Here's the thing, because people get all contorted and bent out of shape when they learn that Martin Luther King was spied on. I'm not one of these people. Like, yes, I believe in a citizen's right to privacy. I believe in the First Amendment, things of this nature. At the same time, when you're in a war, things sometimes get ugly. That's triggering for a lot of people. It's hard for many people to hear. But we can all stand to be a little bit more like General Patton when it comes to our approach to war. And we were at war. We were at war against a deadly ideology that is responsible for the deaths and the starvation of millions of people over the course of the 20th century. This is not a game. When you look at the Communist manifesto, when you look at the Communist strategy, it's literally in their writing that they want to destroy Western civilization, that they want to destroy America, right? How many political parties do you see that have in their literature, we want to destroy America, that we want to destroy Western civilization? The fact is, when it came to communist tactics in America, you necessarily needed to figure out what they were going, like what was going on, like what exactly were you guys up to, instead of just treating them like, oh, well, you know, democracy is going to win. People will figure it out. And like, no, like these people, like they move different. I'm reminded of a young Ronald Reagan. I think this was in 1947. He was brought before the Committee on Un-American Affairs, Un-American Activities. And he was asked about communism. And he gave some kind of milquetoast answer of, well, you know, I believe democracy will win. I believe that people will reject communism. Democracy will take care of it. We don't need to outlaw communism. We don't need to outlaw, you know, that this ideology. People have the First Amendment right to free speech. I think democracy will win. That was a very naive thing to say. You're dealing with a different animal, and you need to treat that animal with the due and necessary force that you will deal with any out of control animal that seeks to destroy everything in its path. Mm-hmm. And again, that's hard for us in the 21st century to comprehend or get our heads around, because it's like we believe that everything is supposed to fit perfectly within the lines and da da da.
Sure.
Like that's how countries get destroyed.
Yeah.
So my question becomes, does a nation have a right to protect its framework against efforts to destroy said country? Yes. Does a country have a right to do that?
Yeah.
If it doesn't, okay. But if it does, then you explain to me, how do you go about investigating the underground communist agenda in America? You just leave it be? Now, Ronald Reagan would eventually come around to the notion that these people mean business. Like we can't be soft or kind to them. I believe that Ronald Reagan was compromised in many ways, even in his administration when he became president, including by his own vice president, who was a plant, and who I think is responsible for pushing Ronald Reagan to sign Martin Luther King Day into a national holiday. But that's neither here nor there. Again, I believe that J. Edgar Hoover was doing what was necessary to investigate these deadly ideologies, to see what was going on, to see what they were up to, in order to protect the Constitution, quite frankly. And sometimes you it's going to get ugly. All is fair in war. And we were at war. And if you don't believe that we're at war, then it's easy for you to say, oh, First Amendment, we have to, like, you have to respect their privacy. Okay. Well, if I become president, I know who not to put in charge of, you know, the military or anything like that, you know?
It's very convoluted because on the one hand, you know, you've tied a lot of dots, even in your upcoming film. You talk about Russia and their influence in the, you know, the spy game and how that was subverting America through people like Martin Luther King eventually. So as the seeds were being planted in Martin Luther King Jr.'s beliefs about the world, his framework for what he believed with Marxism and everything else, that was right dead in the middle of what was going on in Russia with the Gulag Archipelago and everything about that. Yet we, in World War II, we did align with Russia. So I don't know if there's a question in here or what, because we align ourselves with who we would call our enemy only a decade later. And now we have a Holocaust museum in every city, but relatively few people know about the Gulag Archipelago, or what they call the Holodomor, where more than tens and tens of millions died. But yet you can't go, 10 steps in today's day and age without hearing about the 6 million Jews that died. So
we don't know about,
it's super confusing.
We don't know about the Gulag Archipelago, but we know about the Diary of Anne Frank. Give me a break. I mean, it's the communist ideology, once again, is responsible for killing literally millions of people. Stalin starved his own people to death. Like, when you look at the imagery and the torture that was going on in the gulags, like, this is just inhumane. Like, this is worse than the medieval times in terms of the torture that was going on.
Well, people only see the photos of the concentration camps in and around Germany.
Exactly.
If they see pictures from the gulags, they probably think, without knowing, that it's German concentration camps, just because we've been so indoctrinated.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing is, I mean, when it comes to FDR was a despot. He was a tyrant. He was a lunatic. He was an idiot. And the fact is, when it came to the battles that did come to American shores, it happened by he had knowledge of these things happening before they happened, right? Because he wanted to, in a sense, emotionalize the American people into being supportive of us getting involved in World War II in aligning with the Soviet Union. And so it's interesting because we had our own dictator here in the form of FDR. And we're over there trying to fight another dictator in the form of Adolf Hitler. I mean, it's interesting. One of the projects I plan on doing with my film company is to investigate the truth behind World War II and our involvement in it, because I think that's a story that needs to be told as well. But it's interesting because, to the point that you're making, I would add that, and you probably made this point before as well, but it's interesting that, when you look at, when you see the swastika, of course, that's supposed to invoke terror and, horror and all the things. Meanwhile, people walk around with the image, the likeness of Che Guevara on their t-shirts and the hammer and sickle. I see all the time. I mean, especially when I go up near SMU, you see people, here in Dallas, you see people with backpacks with the hammer and sickle pin on their backpacks. The communist fist, right? That doesn't invoke horror and terror because our public school system, again, teaches this kind of one-sided emphasis on the Holocaust being this horrific thing. And meanwhile, they never touch the gulags. They never touch, once again, this ideology that's responsible for killing way more people than Nazism could ever dream of. Now, that's not to say that Nazism is good. In my opinion, Nazism, National Socialism, is one and the same with Soviet imperialism, which is what Stalin represented. That is the spreading of communism around the world. This is what they were interested in doing, including here in the United States. They wanted to Sovietize the United States of America. And so when you look at what Stalin represented, which was Soviet imperialism, and you look at what Hitler represented, which was National Socialism, those are sprung from the same Hegelian seed, the same Marxist seed. And so whenever I point out the fact that communism was much worse, I'm not at the same time saying that Nazism was great.
Sure.
They're both demonic and evil.
Yeah. Well, the good thing is the public consciousness is getting to the point now on these things where a big margin, probably the majority of my audience, needs no further explanation. They know exactly what you're talking about. And then in general, there's just a lot more people now that get it. what you're saying than even 3 years ago. So there is a consciousness and an awareness rising about exactly what we're talking about right now. And I think that's a good thing, that we don't have to spend 5 minutes to make sure that people understand that you're not defending Hitler. So,
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, let's get back here to what would have been your vision that could have been the best thing, consider all things considered, right before Martin Luther King came on the scene. The black community was in a certain position in America. And, America in general was where it was. What could have been a different vision that would have been extremely beneficial for all parties involved?
Well, we get to that in our film. I know you watched a rough cut at 40 minutes of the film where we talk about the trajectory that America was going in prior to the rise of Martin Luther King's popularity, where you saw the repealing of Jim Crow ordinances at the private and local level. Had things continued in that direction, you would have had the dual benefit of genuine race relations on the one hand, and the maintaining of somewhat of a smaller government on the other hand. And that's important. That's key. What we got instead was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the popularity of MLK, and by extension of that, continued race grievance policies that continue on to this very day.
Yeah.
In the form of such things as DEI and CRT. And sure, Trump is rolling back some of the DEI stuff at the federal level, but all it takes is the election of another Democrat or Republican, for all that matter, to implement or re-implement those policies again. So it's like it's a winning of a battle, but it's certainly not the winning of the war.
And it's not fully truthful either, because whether you're talking about Donald Trump, or even, I'll just pick out random names, Tulsi Gabbard, or any number of them that are being appointed to positions. If you say, what do you think about Dr. Martin Luther King? They'd say, oh my, like what a respected figure that we should all venerate. What an American hero. So it's based on a false premise to begin with. So that's why I don't fully. Now, if they were to come out and say, hey, if Donald Trump came out and said, I just saw this interview with Chad Jackson, I'm going to watch his film, very important for the American people to understand that we were taken. And it started back a long time ago, but Martin Luther King is not the man that you think he was. Now, if he said that and rolled back DEI, now we're getting somewhere.
There you go. So again, so that dual benefit that I just mentioned earlier, had things continued the way that they were going before Martin Luther King, I think is important, because what we got instead is, once again, the civil rights movement, which not only expanded the role of the federal government, it did something very weird to Black American culture.
Yeah.
It made Black American culture more degenerate, more entitled. I mean, I think that halftime show at the Super Bowl is kind of a picture of the current state of Black culture. Just, you're literally praising gang culture on national television. Just an absolute mess.
I thought you didn't watch it.
I didn't watch it, but I saw some snippets of it.
Sure. And
the red and blue, it's very obvious what's going on there with the Bloods and the Crips.
Sure.
And so the point that I'm making is, like, you don't go from 3 out of 4 Black children growing up in a 2-parent household prior to the 1960s to where we currently are, where 70+% of Black kids are growing up in single mother households, if not for a cultural shift. What Martin Luther King preached was this notion that all we have to do is pass laws and everything will be dandy. What he did in an underhanded way is detach our sense of prosperity from what we are doing with our own hands, from what our men are doing. And he detached it from that and then reattached it to what the government is going to do. Mm-hmm. Policies, laws, programs, welfare. And so we let our hand off the proverbial plow as a culture. And I think this is pretty much affirmed in a 2019 Cato Institute study, a survey, I should say, where they asked different people of different ethnic groups, um, which do they favor, socialism or capitalism? They asked Asians, whites, blacks, and Hispanics. Blacks were the only ethnic group that had a higher view of socialism than of capitalism. I think it was like 40. 60% of black folks have a favorable view of socialism. All other ethnicities had a more favorable view of capitalism. So that gives you kind of a picture of the current state of black culture as a result of something that happened in the during the civil rights movement, which was once again this kind of shift in mindset. So even this notion that Martin Luther King caused the racists to come together, first of all, it's not really true. But even if it were true, the circumstances under which blacks and whites, quote unquote, came together is something that I'm not very interested in. Namely, that this idea of people coming together under the behest of the civil rights movement means whites walking on eggshells around blacks so as to not offend or hurt feelings or whatever, and blacks having the sense of entitlement. They can say whatever they want, do whatever they want. You owe me. America owes me. America's never been good to me. This is kind of smug, grotesque disposition. Yeah. That is what you call. One needs to do nothing more than just turn on CNN or whatever and look at the panel. And I've seen it on Fox News, even the panel, the panelists that they have, black, white, whatever. White person says something innocent. Black person goes off, rants and raves, and you don't know what it's like to walk in my. That's the image of what Martin Luther King did, right? Yeah. Whereas had things continued in the way that they were going, where blacks and whites were coming together out of their own volition, either due to market interests, through the Christian faith, which we saw was going on with certain Protestant churches, where blacks were coming and whites were coming together around faith similarities. Had things continue in that trajectory where people in the private sector are coming together out of their own volition, that's genuine brotherly coming together, and that's something that's sustainable. In such a dynamic, there is no entitlement versus eggshell walking. Yeah. But that's what you got out of
the civil rights movement. You and me get to know each other. It's based on common interest and common philosophy of Christian faith. I mean, that's it.
Exactly. And so what we get from Martin Luther King is this facade of improved race relations on the one hand, and a ever expanding federal government on the other hand. And so it's all, once again, it's all theater. And so again, sorry for my long-winded ways of answering your questions, but a better program would have been something similar to what Joseph H. Jackson was advocating for, which is exactly what was happening prior to Martin Luther King in terms of people coming together out of their own volition around shared interests. He wasn't advocating for nonviolent action and protesting and all this other nonsense. He was more interested in blacks improving themselves in terms of their education, in terms of their skills, in terms of starting businesses, basically repeating the same things that Booker T. Washington was talking about prior to his death in 1915, which was showing real results. And what Booker T. Washington said, which I believe is so true, is that when people focus on improving themselves, and they make themselves useful to the world, irrespective of what their race is, other people will come to you for your services, for your goods, and over that transaction, you begin to learn more about each other, and racial barriers and racial tensions will begin to fall away naturally. And so those are the kind of things that Joseph H. Jackson was talking about. And that's a program that I'm more interested in than what Martin Luther King was trying to do. And by the way, Joseph H. Jackson was the president of the National Baptist Convention, which prior to 1961, Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King's father preached at, was under this convention. Martin Luther King and his ilk wanted to overthrow.
Chad, something happened with your mic. your mic. It,
Let's
just,
see here.
we lost your good mic.
Better.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Martin Luther King and his ilk wanted to oust Joseph H. Jackson from the National Baptist Convention, and they wanted to take over leadership in the convention to move this conservative, fundamental gospel preaching entity to a radical social justice preaching entity. And when they failed to do so, and got kicked out of the National Baptist Convention, they went and started the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Then they started the Christian leadership, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a Marxist front group. So yeah, there's a whole history there.
Give us the outlay for where you're at with your upcoming film. Tell us a little bit about what your hopes and your goals are for it and what it's about.
So the film that I'm making is called the MLK Project, and I'm relentlessly working on it, trying to get it done by April. And it's giving a history, not only it's not just telling the story of Martin Luther King. It's giving a backstory of how America was formed, and that's important. That's an important story to tell, simply because what Martin Luther King was doing in his "I Have a Dream" speech was painting a different picture of America. The picture that he was painting was that of a Marxist utopia. That is not what the founding fathers envisioned. Of course, I don't agree with all of the founding fathers. Some of them were Satanists, but to the extent that you had, there's a lot of unsung heroes who are part of the men who are responsible for making America, who were ministers, who were family men, who belonged to the, who participated in that delegate of men who gave us what we now know as the Constitution. And what they were doing whenever they formed the, first it was the Confederation of the States. Hold on one second.
You lose your chair?
Yeah. It keeps sliding down on me. But yeah, so first you had the Confederation of the States, which emphasized the importance of state sovereignty. And then you had the Constitution, which was later ratified after they won the war, as you well know. But what they were envisioning was a nation of states that emphasize the importance of sovereignty and family. And they were doing so with the backdrop of world history, knowledge of world history, as well as knowledge of the history of the settlers here in the here in America, that did try to implement some kind of socialist or communist system. I know Jamestown is an example of that, as well as Plymouth, where they tried to implement a kind of communal system, which resulted in famine, multiple deaths, so on and so forth.
Do they still teach that in school? Because I
don't think
saw
they
it on
do.
your film and I barely remembered it. I couldn't even remember if I learned it in school.
I know they didn't teach that in my school. Okay. But it's important to understand. It's important to understand trial and error. And I think what Jamestown and Plymouth give us is trial and error. They tried the communist system. It had fatal results, and they moved away from it, and they implemented private property. So private property is what our founding fathers had in mind when they established our country. It wasn't at all what Martin Luther King was advocating for in 1963 during the March on Washington. So in our film, we establish that, and we try to do so in a seamless way. We try to give that backstory and not bore people with this history, but we do so because it's important to know. We also are going to tell the history of communist attempts to infiltrate the church. And we're going to do all of this as we kind of build up to identifying who Martin Luther King really was, what he was all about, what he was trying to do. You can't just come out of the gate swinging on Martin Luther King. You have to give that historical context, and you have to give that background, because a lot of us, I would argue most of us, to the point that you just made actually about what you learned at school, a lot of us are operating from a education system that was hell-bent on turning us into statists, that was hell-bent on turning us into wards of the state.
Oh, yeah.
Not even like, gleaning from the dole or becoming welfare recipients, but just in terms of being overly compliant to stupid laws and stupid regulations and ordinances, like wearing a mask when you walk into a restaurant, but you can take it off when you sit down. We all know what 2020 was like, and so many people were willing and ready to be compliant to that. Yeah. And my question was, why? Like, why are you so, like, are you not an American? Why are you so compliant with these draconian rules and regulations? And the reason I would say is because we were educated, we were indoctrinated to be so weak and so compliant in that respect.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so because we are operating from a mythologized education curriculum, I think it's necessary to deconstruct a lot of what we think we know about our history, and to reconstruct the truth of what actually happened before I get to Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I'm doing with the film. Like I said, I'm working on it every day, and my hope is to have it out by April. And when it is out, I'm going to have an in-person screening in Atlanta, Georgia, another one in Dallas. I want to do one in Franklin, Tennessee. That's to be determined. But for sure, Atlanta and Dallas, and then it's going to be released on my website.
Well, even if you don't come to Franklin, which is where I'm at, if you do it in Atlanta, I want to know. I want to come.
Okay. Totally.
That would be great. If people want to learn more, I've got the link to learn more about your film in the description of this video. But is there is there a website for the film right now already?
So, I'm going to create a website. If I don't have a website created by April, then I'm just going to release it on chadojackson.com.
Okay. chadojackson.com. All right. We'll keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Well, let's do
and
this.
Strangely enough, I've been getting a lot of requests from people to make DVDs, to have DVDs manufactured for the film, which I didn't even know people still watch DVDs, but it makes sense. I mean, I collect vinyl records just so I can have a hard copy of of my favorite music. So I get it. So yeah, I think I'm going to do that too, is have it released by way of my website and DVDs.
That'll be very cool. Well, Chad, I want to do this if you don't mind. I want to close it out for the people watching on Rumble and YouTube and the other platforms. I would love to have you on for like 5 more minutes just for my paid Substack subscribers for a couple questions that'll only be for them. Do you have 5 to 10 more minutes?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Well, for my Rumble guys, my YouTube guys, and on X, thank you for watching. And Chad, thank you for coming on. Man, you've been a hero to me, and I really appreciate all your hard work around researching the truth and getting it out to the public.
Thank you.